In the vast expanse of space where civilizations rise and fall like cosmic tides, there exists a truth that few dare to acknowledge. Humans are not what they seem. Behind their seemingly fragile exterior lies something far more dangerous, far more protective, and far more loyal than any alien species has ever encountered. What happens when a telepathic being, gifted with the ability to read minds across species, finally breaches the mental barriers? What secrets lie buried in the depths of human consciousness? And what terrible, beautiful truth about protection and sacrifice will she discover? This is the story of Zara, a mind weaver of the Etherian race, whose telepathic abilities made her the most feared interrogator in the galaxy. This is the story of Marcus, a human traitor whose quiet demeanor hid depths that no alien had ever suspected. And this is the story of a revelation that would shake the foundations of everything Zara believed about the strange species called humanity. Some minds are meant to be read, others are meant to be protected. But what happens when the barrier between protector and protected dissolves, and the truth becomes impossible to ignore? The answer lies in the memories of a man who never spoke of his past, and in the mind of an alien who thought she understood the nature of every thinking being in the universe. She was wrong, and that mistake would change everything. The detention cells aboard the Etherian vessel Thoughtseeker hummed with a low vibration of containment fields. Zara stood before the transparent barrier, her elongated fingers pressed against the cool surface as she studied the human sitting calmly on the simple bench within. Her species, the Etherians, were known throughout the galaxy for their telepathic abilities, and Zara was considered one of their most gifted mindweavers. She had broken through the mental defenses of Krillian war criminals, extracted vital intelligence from Zephyrian spies, and even managed to navigate the chaotic thought patterns of the insectoid hive queens. But this human, this unremarkable-looking traitor named Marcus Chen, presented a puzzle that had consumed her thoughts for the past 3 standard cycles. Marcus sat with his hands folded in his lap, his dark eyes focused on some invisible point beyond the cell walls. He wore simple trader's clothing, the kind of practical garments favored by those who spent their lives moving cargo between star systems. There was nothing particularly imposing about him. He stood perhaps 6 feet tall, with the lean build of someone who worked with his hands rather than his mind. His black hair was touched with gray at the temples, suggesting he was in his middle years by human standards. Yet despite his ordinary appearance, Marcus had done something that should have been impossible. 3 days ago, the Etherian patrol had intercepted his cargo vessel, the Silent Promise, in the disputed Tau Ceti system. Intelligence suggested he was smuggling restricted technology to the human colony worlds, technology that could shift the balance of power in the ongoing territorial disputes. When the standard interrogation techniques failed to produce results, they had called in Zara. She was expecting a routine mind probe, the kind she had performed thousands of times before. What she encountered instead defied everything she understood about telepathy and consciousness. The human mind she had discovered during her first attempt was unlike any other she had encountered. Where other species maintained their thoughts in organized patterns, human consciousness seemed to exist in layers. Most beings thought in linear progressions, their minds following logical pathways that a skilled mindweaver could trace and explore. But human thoughts moved in spirals, connecting past and present, emotion and logic, memory and imagination in ways that created an almost maze-like mental landscape. Zara had initially attributed this complexity to the unique evolution of human neural pathways. Earth, she knew, was a death world by galactic standards. The gravity was crushing, the weather patterns violent and unpredictable, and the planet teemed with predators that had forced humanity to develop in ways that made them seem almost aggressive to other species. Perhaps their mental complexity was simply another adaptation to their harsh homeworld. But when she had attempted to push deeper into Marcus's mind, seeking the information about his alleged smuggling operations, she had encountered something that stopped her cold. Behind the surface thoughts, behind the maze-like complexity of human consciousness, lay something that felt like a wall. Not a mental barrier of the kind that trained individuals sometimes constructed to resist telepathic intrusion, but something far more fundamental. It was as if his mind existed in multiple dimensions, and she could only perceive the most surface layer. Now, 3 days later, she stood outside his cell preparing for another attempt. The ship's commander, Vex High, had grown impatient with her lack of progress. The Etherian High Command wanted answers about human military capabilities, and Marcus was their best source of information. As a trader who moved between human colony worlds, he would have seen their defenses, their technology, their preparations for the territorial expansion that had the galactic community so concerned. Zara activated the cell's communication system, and Marcus looked up at the sound of the soft chime. His expression was neither hostile nor fearful, simply patient. She found that patience unnerving. Most beings, when faced with telepathic interrogation, displayed some level of anxiety or defiance. Marcus seemed genuinely unconcerned, as if he were simply waiting for something inevitable to occur. "You know why I'm here," she said, her voice carrying the subtle harmonics that marked her as an Etherian. Their species communicated as much through psychic resonance as through spoken words, and she could sense the edges of most beings' thoughts even in casual conversation. Marcus nodded slowly. "You want information about the human colonies? About our defenses, our technology, our intentions?" His voice was steady, unremarkable except for a quality that Zara couldn't quite identify. There was something beneath the words, a weight that suggested far more than he was saying. "The technology you were carrying could be used to upgrade weapons systems," Zara continued, settling into the formal rhythm of interrogation. "Your ship's manifest listed them as agricultural equipment, but our scans detected energy signatures consistent with military applications." "Agricultural equipment can have many applications," Marcus replied. "A tool that helps farmers clear rocky soil might also be useful for defensive fortifications. That doesn't make the farmer a warrior." Zara studied his face, looking for the telltale signs of deception that usually accompanied lies. But Marcus's expression remained calm, his breathing steady, his body language relaxed. More importantly, she could sense no spike in his emotional patterns, no increase in stress indicators that typically marked falsehood. Either he was telling the truth, or he had trained himself to control his responses to a degree that seemed unlikely for a simple cargo hauler. "I'm going to read your mind again," she announced, moving closer to the containment field. "I suggest you don't resist. It only makes the process more difficult." For the first time since their conversations had begun, Marcus showed a reaction. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "I'm not resisting, Mindweaver. I never have been." The statement sent a chill through Zara's consciousness. If Marcus wasn't actively resisting her telepathic probes, then the barriers she had encountered were natural features of his mind. But that seemed impossible. No species evolved natural defenses against telepathy unless they had been subjected to telepathic predation for millions of years. Earth had no native telepathic species, no evolutionary pressure that would have driven such development. She placed her palm against the control panel that regulated the containment field's permeability. During telepathic interrogation, the field could be adjusted to allow psychic contact while maintaining physical separation. As the field shifted to its more permeable setting, Zara felt the familiar sensation of expanded consciousness that preceded a deep mind probe. Closing her eyes, she reached out with her telepathic abilities, feeling for the edges of Marcus's consciousness. The initial contact was always the most delicate part of the process. Push too hard, too fast, and the subject's mind could shut down entirely. Move too slowly, and trained individuals could construct additional defenses, or even attempt to mislead the probe. But as her consciousness touched the outer layers of Marcus's mind, she realized that the human's mental landscape was even more complex than she had initially understood. What she had taken for a simple maze was actually something far more sophisticated. Human thoughts, she discovered, existed in a kind of quantum superposition, simultaneously holding multiple contradictory ideas and possibilities, until observation or decision collapsed them into a single state. She pushed deeper, following pathways of memory and association that twisted and turned in patterns that defied her understanding. She glimpsed fragments of Marcus's life, childhood memories of a blue sky and green fields, the cramped quarters of his first starship, the faces of countless strangers encountered in spaceports throughout the galaxy. But beneath these surface memories lay something else, something that pulled at her attention like a gravitational field. There were other memories, older and somehow more significant, but they seemed to exist behind that same inexplicable barrier she had encountered before. She pressed against it, using techniques that had never failed her in the past, but the barrier held firm. It wasn't actively resisting her probe, which would have indicated trained mental defenses. Instead, it simply was. As immutable as the laws of physics, as fundamental as the structure of space-time itself. But this time, as she maintained contact with the barrier, something unexpected happened. Instead of the usual resistance or deflection she encountered when dealing with mental defenses, she began to sense something from the other side. Not thoughts, exactly, but awareness. As if something within Marcus's mind was observing her attempts to breach his defenses. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The barrier wasn't keeping her out, it was keeping something in. Zara jerked back from the telepathic contact, her eyes snapping open as she stared at Marcus in shock. He was watching her with what she now recognized as concern, his previously calm expression replaced by something that looked almost like sympathy. "You felt it, didn't you?" he said quietly. "The barrier." She nodded, unable to trust her voice. In all her years as a mind weaver, she had never encountered anything like what she had just experienced. The barrier in Marcus's mind wasn't a defense against telepathic intrusion. It was a containment system, holding something back from the rest of his consciousness. "What are you?" she whispered. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as if he were looking through the walls of the detention cell to something far beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Zara's telepathic senses tingle with barely contained power. "I'm someone who's been protecting you," he said simply. "All of you. From the moment your ship detected mine and decided to investigate, I've been keeping you safe from something you couldn't possibly understand." The word sent a wave of confusion through Zara's mind. Protecting them? From what? Marcus was their prisoner, contained within a detention cell, aboard one of the most advanced ships in the Etherian fleet. How could he possibly be protecting anyone from anything? But even as the logical part of her mind rejected his statement, her telepathic abilities were picking up something else. The barrier in Marcus's mind, she realized, wasn't static. It was active, requiring constant maintenance and control. And the energy signature she was sensing from the other side wasn't malevolent or threatening. It was careful, controlled, as if something immensely powerful was deliberately holding itself back. "You're not making sense," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she found herself doubting her own certainty. "You're our prisoner. How could you be protecting us from anything?" Marcus stood slowly, moving to the front of the cell, where the containment field shimmered between them. Up close, Zara could see details she had missed before. The slight tremor in his hands that suggested constant strain, the way his breathing followed a deliberately controlled pattern, the tension around his eyes that spoke of someone carrying an enormous burden. 3 days ago, when your ship first locked onto mine with a targeting scanner, you triggered an automatic response, he said, his voice growing quieter with each word. Something that's been programmed into every human for longer than our recorded history. Something that identifies threats to our companions. Zara felt a chill run down her spine. "Companions? The other species we travel with?" Marcus said, and for the first time since she had met him, she heard something like pain in his voice. "The ones who don't know what they're traveling with. The ones who think we're just cargo haulers and traders and explorers, wandering the galaxy in search of profit and adventure. The implications of his words hit her like a wave of ice water. You're saying there are humans throughout the galaxy, working alongside other species. And they're all protecting them, Marcus finished. Teddy, yes, we have been for longer than most civilizations have existed. And until today, until you pushed deep enough into my mind to sense the barrier, no one had ever realized it. Zara's mind raced as she tried to process what she was hearing. If Marcus was telling the truth, then humanity's expansion into the galaxy wasn't the aggressive territorial grab that most species believed it to be. It was something else entirely. But protecting other species from what? And why did it require the kind of mental containment she had sensed in his mind? I don't understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Protecting us from what? Marcus moved even closer to the containment field until only the shimmering barrier separated them. When he spoke, his words carried a finality that made Zara's telepathic senses recoil in instinctive fear. From what we become when we stop holding back, he said. From what happens when a human decides that someone they're protecting is no longer worth protecting. From what my species is capable of when we stop pretending to be civilized. The detention cell fell silent except for the hum of the containment field. Zara stared at the human traitor, her mind struggling to comprehend the implications of what she had just learned. Everything she thought she knew about humanity, about their role in galactic society, about their motivations and capabilities, had just been revealed as carefully constructed misdirection. But even more disturbing was the growing certainty that Marcus was telling her the truth. Her telepathic abilities might not be able to penetrate the barrier in his mind, but they could still read his emotional patterns, his stress responses, and everything she sensed confirmed that he believed every word he was saying. "Show me," she said, her voice stronger now despite the fear coursing through her consciousness. "If you are really protecting us from something, show me what it is." Marcus studied her face for a long moment, and she saw something that looked like regret flicker across his features. "Are you certain? Once you know, you can never unknow. Once you understand what humans really are, your entire perspective on the galaxy will change." Zara nodded, though part of her was screaming that she was making a terrible mistake. But she was a mind weaver, dedicated to uncovering truth regardless of the consequences. And the truth about humanity was the greatest mystery she had ever encountered. Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "Then I'm going to lower the barrier," he said quietly. "Just for a moment. Just enough for you to understand. But you need to be ready to break the telepathic contact immediately if I tell you to. Because once you see what's on the other side, you'll understand why we work so hard to keep it contained." Zara pressed her palm against the containment field's control panel, adjusting the settings to allow for deeper telepathic contact. As her consciousness reached out to touch Marcus's mind once more, she felt the barrier she had encountered before. But this time, instead of the immutable wall she had experienced previously, she sensed something shifting, moving aside just enough to allow her the briefest glimpse of what lay beyond. What she saw in that instant would haunt her for the rest of her life. The moment Marcus allowed the barrier to thin, Zara's consciousness was flooded with a torrent of sensation and memory that defied everything she understood about the nature of sentient thought. What she encountered wasn't just the hidden thoughts of a single human mind, but something far more vast and interconnected. It was as if she had touched a single node in a network that stretched across the galaxy, connecting every human consciousness in a web of shared purpose and terrible knowledge. The first thing she experienced was pain, not physical pain, but the deep, grinding anguish of constant vigilance, of holding back something that wanted desperately to be released. She felt Marcus's struggle as if it were her own, the enormous effort required to maintain the barriers that kept his true nature contained. But beneath that pain lay something that made her telepathic senses recoil in instinctive terror. Power. Raw, unfiltered, and utterly alien in its scope and intensity. It was like touching the surface of a star and discovering that what seemed like fire was actually ice, that what appeared to be destruction was actually the most precise and controlled force in the universe. The barrier wasn't keeping Marcus's humanity in check. It was restraining something that had been merged with humanity so completely that the distinction between human and other had become meaningless. Through the brief contact, she caught fragmentary glimpses of memories that belonged to Marcus, but felt impossibly ancient. She saw Earth not as the peaceful garden world that humans now described in their stories, but as a battlefield where something vast and dark had fought a war against itself for millions of years. She saw the moment when humanity first encountered this other presence, not as conquerors or destroyers, but as unexpected allies in a conflict that predated civilization itself. The memories came in flashes, too quick and too alien for her to fully comprehend. She saw humans standing alongside beings of pure energy as they faced something that existed in the spaces between dimensions. She witnessed the moment when the energy beings, defeated and dying, made a choice that would echo through time. Instead of fighting to preserve their own existence, they chose to merge with the young species that had shown them kindness, becoming something new and unprecedented in the galaxy's history. But the merger hadn't been simple or clean. The energy beings, she caught fragments of their name, something that translated roughly as the Watchers or the Guardians, had possessed capabilities that were fundamentally incompatible with organic consciousness. They could manipulate matter at the quantum level, alter the flow of time in localized areas, and perceive probability streams that allowed them to predict and prevent catastrophic events before they occurred. When they merged with humanity, these abilities had been retained but locked away behind barriers that required constant maintenance. Every human born after the merger carried this dual nature. They were simultaneously the curious, adaptable species that had evolved on Earth, and inheritors of powers that could reshape reality itself. The barriers in their minds weren't defenses against external threats. They were safeguards against accidentally destroying everything around them. Zara felt Marcus's consciousness guiding her through the flood of revelations, helping her process information that would have shattered a less trained mind. She experienced his childhood memories again, but this time she understood what she was seeing. The careful way his parents had taught him to control his emotions wasn't typical human child-rearing. It was training designed to strengthen the barriers that kept his inherited abilities contained. The meditation techniques he practiced weren't for relaxation. They were exercises in maintaining the quantum locks that prevented him from accidentally altering local space-time. She saw his first trip off-world when he was barely 18 standard years old, and felt his terror as he realized that the barriers that had seemed so secure on Earth became unstable in the different gravitational and electromagnetic fields of other planets. She experienced his desperate efforts to adapt, to learn new forms of control that would keep him safe to be around as he traveled between star systems. But most shocking of all, she witnessed the moment when he had first encountered an alien species in distress. The ship had been a Zephyrian transport, carrying refugees from a failed colony world. Their life support systems had malfunctioned, and without immediate assistance, over 300 beings would have died in the cold vacuum of space. Marcus had been alone on his cargo hauler, too far from any station or patrol ship to call for help. Through their telepathic connection, Zara experienced the decision that had changed everything for Marcus. She felt his internal struggle as he weighed the lives of the Zephyrians against the risk of revealing his true nature. She sensed the moment when he chose to act, when he allowed the barriers to thin just enough to let him manipulate the quantum fields that govern matter and energy. What she saw next defied every law of physics she understood. Marcus had reached out with abilities that existed at the intersection of consciousness and reality itself, restructuring the damaged components of the Zephyrian ship at the molecular level. In the span of minutes, he had repaired systems that should have required days of work. He had saved every life on that transport without the Zephyrians ever knowing how their salvation had been accomplished. But saving them had required him to push his barriers to their breaking point. For days afterward, he had struggled to regain control, to rebuild the mental safeguards that kept him from accidentally affecting everything around him. And in that struggle, he had discovered something that would define the rest of his life. The more he used his abilities to help others, the stronger his barriers became. It was as if the act of protection itself reinforced the controls that made such protection possible. Through the connection, Zara felt the weight of Marcus's realization. Humanity hadn't spread across the galaxy as conquerors or explorers. They had dispersed as guardians, each human taking responsibility for protecting the species and civilizations they encountered. It was a burden that few of them could share with anyone, a secret that had to be maintained to prevent the very panic and fear that would make their protection necessary. She experienced Marcus's life over the following decades, seeing how he had gradually built relationships with beings throughout the galaxy, while never revealing his true nature. She felt his constant vigilance, the way he monitored local space for signs of danger, the careful adjustments he made to prevent conflicts and catastrophes that other species never even knew were approaching. His cargo hauling business was real, but it was also the perfect cover for a protector who needed to move freely between star systems. The memories showed her other humans as well, scattered throughout the galaxy in roles that seemed mundane but were actually positions of incredible responsibility. She saw human diplomats whose empathic abilities allowed them to prevent wars before they started, human engineers whose understanding of quantum mechanics let them design technologies that worked more efficiently than they should have, human doctors whose intuitive knowledge of biological systems helped them save lives. That conventional medicine would have given up as lost. But the most disturbing revelation came when she experienced Marcus's reaction to the Etherian ship that had intercepted him. She felt the automatic response that had triggered the moment their sensors locked onto his vessel, the way his inherited abilities had immediately begun analyzing the threat and calculating response options. In that instant, she realized that Marcus hadn't been captured by the Thoughtseeker. He had allowed himself to be captured because his analysis had determined that this was the safest outcome for everyone involved. The alternative options that had flashed through his consciousness in those first moments made Zara's telepathic senses recoil in terror. She saw probability streams where the Etherian ship simply ceased to exist, not destroyed but unmade at the quantum level, as if it had never been constructed. She witnessed potential futures where the crew found themselves transported to the edge of the galaxy, alive and unharmed but hopelessly lost. Most frightening of all, she glimpsed scenarios where Marcus allowed his full abilities to manifest, transforming local space-time into configurations that would have protected everyone present while simultaneously demonstrating power that would have shattered their understanding of what was possible. He had chosen capture and interrogation because it was the path that offered the greatest probability of maintaining the secret that protected not just humanity but every species they had sworn to guard. Even now, locked in a detention cell and subjected to telepathic probing, he was still protecting them from the truth of what he was and what he could do. But the connection was showing her more than just Marcus's personal history. Through the network that linked all human consciousness, she caught glimpses of the larger picture that few beings in the galaxy could even imagine. She saw the careful orchestration of galactic politics, the way human influence had subtly guided the development of interstellar civilization to prevent the conflicts and catastrophes that their inherited foresight allowed them to perceive. The territorial disputes that had seemed so threatening suddenly looked very different when viewed from this perspective. Humanity's expansion into contested systems wasn't aggressive imperialism. It was a carefully calculated deployment of guardians to regions where their probability projections indicated the highest risk of species-ending conflicts. The smuggling that Marcus had been accused of was actually the distribution of technologies designed to help other species protect themselves, disguised as ordinary trade to avoid the social disruption that would result if their true origin was discovered. She felt the enormous weight of collective responsibility that every human carried, the knowledge that their species had voluntarily accepted guardianship over beings who would never know they were being protected. It was a burden that required constant sacrifice, Constant vigilance, constant restraint in the face of situations where their full capabilities could solve problems instantly but at the cost of revealing truths that would fundamentally alter galactic civilization. Through it all, she sensed Marcus's growing strain as he maintained the telepathic connection, while simultaneously keeping his barriers stable. Showing her these truths was costing him enormously, requiring him to balance revelation with containment in ways that pushed his control systems to their absolute limits. She could feel his consciousness beginning to fracture under the pressure, the careful equilibrium he had maintained for decades starting to destabilize. "Enough," he whispered, and she could hear the pain in his voice even through their telepathic link. "You need to break the connection now, before the barriers fail completely." But Zara found herself unable to withdraw. The knowledge flooding through her consciousness was unlike anything she had ever experienced, revealing connections and patterns that recontextualized everything she thought she knew about the galaxy. She caught glimpses of other species that humanity had been protecting for centuries, civilizations that had avoided extinction or catastrophic conflict because human guardians had been quietly working behind the scenes to guide them away from disaster. "Zara, you have to let go." Marcus's mental voice was becoming strained, tinged with desperation. "If the barriers collapse while we're connected, you'll experience the full scope of what we're containing. Your mind isn't equipped to process that kind of information." But even as she tried to follow his instruction, she felt herself being drawn deeper into the network of human consciousness. The connection she had established with Marcus was expanding, allowing her to sense other nodes in the vast web that linked every human in the galaxy. She began to understand that what she had taken for individual human minds were actually portions of a collective consciousness that spanned light years. A distributed intelligence that could coordinate protection efforts across hundreds of star systems simultaneously. The revelation was staggering. Humanity hadn't just merged with an ancient energy-based species. They had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a collective entity that maintained individual personalities and free will while sharing a deeper level of awareness. Every human was simultaneously themselves and part of something larger, connected through quantum entanglement effects that allowed instant communication across any distance. She sensed the moment when her unauthorized intrusion was detected by the larger network. From across the galaxy, she felt other human minds becoming aware of her presence, their attention focusing on the unprecedented breach of security that her telepathic probe represented. For the first time in human history, an alien consciousness had penetrated deep enough into their collective awareness to understand their true nature. The response was swift and overwhelming. She felt the combined will of millions of human minds working together to contain the security breach, to evaluate the threat she represented, and determine the appropriate response. But to her amazement, what she sensed from the collective wasn't hostility or fear, it was concern. Concern for her well-being, for the psychological trauma that exposure to their true nature might cause, for the burden of knowledge she would now carry. In that moment of contact with the human collective, Zara finally understood the full scope of what Marcus had been trying to tell her. Humanity's protection of other species wasn't motivated by superiority or condescension. It was driven by genuine care, by a love for life and consciousness that had been enhanced by their merger with beings who had spent eons watching over the galaxy's development. They protected others not because they saw them as inferior, but the connection was becoming unstable, the barriers in Marcus's mind beginning to fluctuate as the strain of maintaining contact with both her consciousness and the collective network pushed his control systems beyond their design limits. She could feel reality beginning to warp around the detention cell as quantum fields responded to his growing inability to contain his abilities. "Please," Marcus's voice was barely audible now, his mental presence fracturing as he fought to maintain control. "If you care about your crew, about your species, you have to break the connection now. I can't hold this much longer." Zara felt the truth of his warning in the growing instability of local space-time. The walls of the detention cell were beginning to shimmer as molecular bonds loosened under the influence of uncontrolled quantum manipulation. She could sense the panic of the crew members throughout the ship as their instruments detected energy signatures that shouldn't have been possible according to known physics. With enormous effort, she forced herself to withdraw from the telepathic connection, severing the link that had shown her truths she could never have imagined. As her consciousness snapped back to her own body, she felt Marcus's barrier slamming back into place with such force that the psychic shock nearly knocked her unconscious. She opened her eyes to find herself on her knees in front of the containment cell, her body trembling from the effort of processing so much alien information. Inside the cell, Marcus had collapsed onto his bench, his face pale and drawn as he fought to re-establish the control systems that kept his inherited abilities safely contained. For long moments, they simply stared at each other through the containment field, both of them shaken by what they had experienced. Zara's mind was reeling as she tried to integrate the knowledge she had gained with her previous understanding of galactic civilization. Everything she thought she knew about humanity, about their role in the galaxy, about the nature of consciousness itself, had been fundamentally altered. "Now you know," Marcus said finally, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Now you understand why we work so hard to maintain the secret, why we accept being misunderstood, why we allow other species to see us as primitive or aggressive or opportunistic. Because the truth is too large for most minds to process safely." Zara slowly pulled herself back to her feet, her legs still unsteady from the psychic shock of the connection. She looked at Marcus with new eyes, seeing not the simple cargo hauler she had initially perceived, but a guardian carrying responsibilities that spanned the galaxy. Every casual conversation she had witnessed between humans and aliens, every mundane interaction that had seemed unremarkable, now revealed itself as a carefully orchestrated effort to maintain the greatest deception in galactic history. "What happens now?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The knowledge she carried was too dangerous to remain uncontrolled, too significant to be ignored. Marcus met her gaze with eyes that held depths she was only beginning to understand. "Now," he said quietly, "you have to decide what kind of universe you want to live in. One where the truth remains hidden and billions of beings continue to live in safety, or one where the secret is revealed and everything changes forever?" The choice, Zara realized, would determine not just her own fate, but the future of every species in the galaxy. And for the first time in her life as a mindweaver dedicated to uncovering truth at any cost, she wasn't certain which choice was right. The command deck of the Thought Seeker buzzed with nervous energy as Zara made her way through the corridors toward Commander HFY's quarters. 3 hours had passed since her connection with Marcus, and the ship's crew was growing increasingly agitated by the anomalous energy readings that had spiked throughout the vessel during their telepathic contact. Damage control teams had reported that several systems had experienced spontaneous improvements in efficiency during the event, as if someone had optimized their quantum field alignments at the molecular level. Zara's mind was still reeling from the revelations she had experienced. As she walked through the familiar corridors of the ship, she found herself seeing everything differently. The Etherian crew members she passed weren't just her colleagues, they were beings whose entire civilization existed under the protection of guardians they had never known existed. The very ship they traveled in incorporated design principles that had been subtly influenced by human insights, improvements that had been introduced so gradually over centuries that no one suspected their true origin. She paused outside Commander HFY's quarters, her hand hovering over the door chime as she struggled with the magnitude of what she was about to do. The knowledge she carried could reshape galactic civilization, but it could also destroy the careful equilibrium that had preserved peace and stability for millennia. Marcus's warning echoed in her thoughts. Some truths were too dangerous to reveal, too vast for most minds to safely process. The door chimed at her touch, and she heard Vex's voice inviting her to enter. The commander was standing before the large viewport that dominated one wall of his quarters, gazing out at the stars that seemed so much more meaningful now that Zara understood how carefully their civilizations had been guided among them. Vexii was typical of this species, tall and elegant, with the elongated limbs and enlarged cranium that marked the Etherians as one of the galaxy's most telepathically gifted races. His skin held the faint luminescence that indicated active psychic abilities, and his large, dark eyes reflected an intelligence that had made him one of the youngest ship commanders in the fleet. But as Zara looked at him now, she couldn't help but wonder what he would think if he knew that his telepathic gifts were insignificant compared to the abilities that Marcus kept carefully contained. "Mindweaver, Zara," Vexii said without turning from the viewport. "I trust your extended session with the human prisoner was productive. The energy readings from the detention section were quite remarkable." Zara took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would begin a chain of events that could never be undone. "Commander, I need to report something that goes far beyond our original mission parameters. What I discovered about the human, about Marcus Chen, changes everything we thought we knew about their species." Vexei turned then, his telepathic senses likely picking up the turbulence in her mental state. His expression grew concerned as he gestured for her to take a seat at the small conference table that occupied one corner of his quarters. "You seem disturbed, Mindweaver. What did you find in the human's mind?" Zara settled into the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she struggled to find words for concepts that challenged the fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization. "Commander, what would you say if I told you that humanity wasn't what they appear to be? That their entire presence in galactic society is part of a deception so vast and so carefully maintained that no species has ever suspected its true nature?" The commander's telepathic abilities were focused on her now, reading the surface thoughts that she couldn't quite suppress. She saw his expression change as he picked up fragments of the knowledge she had gained from Marcus, concepts and images that his mind struggled to interpret. That's impossible," he said slowly. "Our intelligence networks have been monitoring human activities for decades. They're traders, explorers, colonists, certainly more aggressive than most species, likely due to their harsh homeworld, but hardly the mysterious figures you're suggesting." "That's exactly what they want us to believe," Zara replied, leaning forward across the table. "Commander, the barriers I encountered in Marcus's mind weren't designed to keep me out. They were designed to keep something in. Something that could reshape reality at the quantum level if it were ever allowed to manifest fully." She watched as Vexei's expression shifted from concern to skepticism to something approaching fear as her words registered. His telepathic senses were confirming that she believed everything she was saying, that her mental state showed none of the indicators associated with delusions or psychological breaks. "Explain," he said simply. Over the next hour, Zara shared everything she had experienced during her connection with Marcus. She described the network of human consciousness that spanned the galaxy, the inherited abilities that allowed them to manipulate matter and energy in ways that violated known physics, the careful orchestration of galactic politics to prevent conflicts that could threaten entire civilizations. She told him about the ancient merger between humanity and the energy beings known as the Watchers, the burden of guardianship that every human carried, and the enormous sacrifice involved in maintaining a secret that protected species who would never know they were being protected. Vexei listened in growing amazement, his telepathic abilities confirming the authenticity of her memories, even as his rational mind struggled to accept their implications. When she finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, staring out at the stars as he processed what she had told him. "If what you're saying is true," he said finally, "then our entire understanding of galactic history needs to be reconsidered. The peace we've enjoyed, the technological advances we've made, the conflicts we've avoided, none of it happened naturally. But humanity has been guiding things, preventing the worst outcomes, introducing innovations at the right moments, placing themselves in positions where they could intervene if necessary. They haven't controlled our development, but they've protected it. The commander stood and began pacing, his mind clearly racing as he considered the implications of her revelation. But why maintain such an elaborate deception? If they possess such capabilities, why not simply reveal themselves as the protectors they claim to be? Because, Zara said, remembering Marcus's anguish as he had shared the truth with her, the knowledge changes everything. Once a species knows they're being protected, they stop developing their own defenses, their own solutions, their own strength. They become dependent, passive, ultimately vulnerable to threats that their protectors might not be able to handle. She paused, then added, the most disturbing truth of all. And because if other species knew what humans really were, knew what they were capable of, fear would replace gratitude. The very beings they're protecting would see them as threats to be eliminated rather than guardians to be trusted. Vex'ai stopped pacing and turned to face her. You're saying that revealing this truth could start a galactic war. I'm saying it would be the last galactic war, Zara replied quietly. Because if humanity ever decided that the species they've been protecting had become threats to be neutralized instead, there wouldn't be anyone left to object. The weight of that statement hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Vex'ai's telepathic senses were confirming that she wasn't exaggerating or speaking metaphorically. The ability she had glimpsed in Marcus's mind, multiplied across millions of humans throughout the galaxy, represented power on a scale that could reshape or eliminate entire civilizations. What does Marcus expect us to do with this knowledge? Vex'ai asked. He expects us to make the same choice that humanity made when they first inherited their abilities, Zara replied. To decide whether to use power for protection or domination, whether to preserve the secret that maintains stability or reveal the truth that could destroy everything. The commander moved back to the viewport, gazing out at the stars with new understanding. And what do you recommend, Mindweaver? Zara was quiet for a long moment, remembering the sense of vast responsibility she had felt through her connection with the human collective. I think, she said slowly, that we need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with before we make any decisions. Commander, the energy readings your crew detected during my telepathic contact with Marcus, they weren't side effects of his abilities manifesting. They were signs that he was actively improving our ship's systems while maintaining the mental barriers that kept him appearing normal. Vex'ai spun around to stare at her. Bertetti, what are you saying? I'm saying that our quantum field generators are now operating at 97% efficiency, instead of their normal 83%. Our sensor array has been optimized to detect threats at twice its previous range. Our communication systems are receiving data streams that our hardware should be theoretically incapable of processing. Zara met his gaze steadily. Marcus has been protecting us from the moment we captured him, even while we were interrogating him, even while we were treating him as a prisoner. He was quietly making our ship safer and more capable than it was before. The implications were staggering. If Marcus could make such improvements while mentally restraining his abilities and maintaining the pretense of being a normal human, what could humanity accomplish if they chose to reveal their true capabilities? But more importantly, what did it say about their nature that they chose protection over power, guardianship over domination, even when those they protected treated them with suspicion and hostility? Vex'ai activated his communication console, signaling for his senior staff, I think it's time we had a broader discussion about our prisoner and what we've learned. But Mindweaver, I want you to understand something. This information cannot leave this ship until we've determined how to handle it responsibly. As they waited for the senior staff to arrive, Zara found herself thinking about the other implications of what she had discovered. Throughout the galaxy, human traders and explorers were going about their daily lives, maintaining the careful illusion of normalcy while carrying burdens that would have broken most other species. They were surrounded by beings they had sworn to protect, beings who saw them as equals or even inferiors, never suspecting that their protectors possessed capabilities that bordered on godlike. But perhaps most remarkable of all was the restraint involved. Every human in the galaxy was constantly choosing limitation over power, choosing to appear weak rather than reveal strength, choosing to be misunderstood rather than demand recognition. It was a level of collective self-sacrifice that challenged everything the Etherians believed about the nature of conscious beings and their relationship to power. The door chimed, and Vexay's senior officers began filing into the quarters. Science Officer Kethara, Navigation Officer Wylon, Security Chief Veshkai, and Communications Officer Nirades took their seats around the conference table, their telepathic senses immediately picking up the tension that filled the room. Officers, Vexay began. Mindweaver Zara has made discoveries during her interrogation of the human prisoner that require immediate discussion and decision. What she's going to share with you will challenge everything we think we know about humanity's role in galactic society. As Zara began to relate her experiences once again, she watched the expressions of the senior staff change from skepticism to amazement to a growing understanding of the magnitude of the choice they now faced. The truth she had uncovered was too significant to ignore, too dangerous to reveal carelessly, and too important to handle without the utmost care. But even as she spoke, she was aware that their discussion was being monitored by someone who possessed capabilities far beyond their ability to detect or prevent. Somewhere in the detention section of their ship, Marcus was listening to every word, evaluating every decision, prepared to take whatever action was necessary to protect not just the secret of humanity's true nature, but the safety of the beings who were now learning that secret. The question that none of them could yet answer was whether learning the truth would make them wiser guardians of that knowledge, or whether it would transform them into the kind of threat that would require humanity to abandon protection in favor of more direct intervention. In the quantum realm that existed beneath conscious thought, probability streams were already shifting as the human collective became aware of the unprecedented breach of security that had occurred aboard the Thoughtseeker. Across the galaxy, Guardians were quietly preparing for scenarios that they had hoped never to face, while continuing to maintain the illusion of normalcy that had preserved galactic peace for millennia. The decision made in the next few hours aboard a single Etherian patrol vessel might determine whether that peace would continue, or whether the time had finally come for humanity to step out of the shadows and reveal themselves as the protectors they had always been. The emergency session in Commander Vexay's quarters stretched into the ship's night cycle, as the senior staff grappled with the implications of Zara's revelations. The atmosphere in the room had grown increasingly tense as each officer processed the knowledge that their understanding of galactic civilization had been fundamentally wrong, that their very existence had been safeguarded by protectors they had never known existed. Science Officer Kethara, her crystalline appendages flickering with the bioluminescent patterns that indicated deep thought among her species, broke the silence that had settled over the group. The technological improvements that Mindweaver Zara described, I've been reviewing our system reports from the past 3 days. The quantum field optimizations alone should have taken our engineering teams weeks to implement, assuming they could have conceived of the modifications at all. Setting. She activated a holographic display that showed the ship's system efficiency ratings. Look at these readings. Our main reactor is producing 12% more power while operating at lower stress levels. Our navigational computers are processing probability calculations that our software shouldn't be capable of running. Even our atmospheric recycling systems are operating at peak efficiency, despite being overdue for maintenance. Navigation Officer Ilon leaned forward, his scaled features reflecting the light from the hologram. You're suggesting that the human, Marcus, has been continuously improving our ship without our knowledge or consent? Not improving, Zara corrected. Protecting. Every modification he's made increases our survivability in a crisis situation. Better power output means stronger shields. Enhanced navigation means we can detect and avoid threats more effectively. Optimized life support means we can sustain emergency operations longer than any hostile force would calculate. Security Chief Veshkai, whose militaristic background made him naturally suspicious of unknown capabilities, spoke with barely controlled tension. So we've been harboring someone who could sabotage our ship at any moment, but instead he's been making it more powerful? That's supposed to make me feel better about this situation? It should. Communications Officer Nirades interjected. her empathic abilities allowing her to sense emotional currents that others missed. This human has been imprisoned, interrogated, and treated with hostility, yet his response has been to make us safer. That suggests a level of benevolent intent that goes beyond what most species would demonstrate under similar circumstances. Commander Vexhai stood and moved to the viewport, his reflection ghost-like against the stars beyond. The question we need to address isn't Marcus's intentions, but what we do with the knowledge we've gained. The Etherian High Council expects a full report on this mission, including our assessment of human military capabilities and territorial ambitions. How do we report that humanity possesses capabilities that could eliminate our entire civilization while choosing instead to protect it? Kethara asked. How do we explain that their territorial expansion is actually a deployment of guardians to regions of highest strategic vulnerability? More importantly, Veshkai added grimly, how do we report this without triggering a preemptive strike against human settlements? If the High Council believes that humanity poses an existential threat to galactic security, they'll recommend military action to the Allied Species Council. The weight of that possibility settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Every officer present knew that an interspecies conflict involving humanity would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever experienced. If humans possessed even a fraction of the capabilities that Zara had glimpsed, conventional warfare would be meaningless. But more terrifyingly, if humanity decided that their protection was no longer welcome, the consequences would be beyond imagining. There's another factor we need to consider, Zara said quietly. During my connection with Marcus, I sensed that our interrogation had been detected by the larger human network. They're aware that their secret has been compromised, at least partially. How they respond to that knowledge may determine whether we have the luxury of deciding what to do with this information. As if summoned by her words, the ship's communication system activated with an incoming transmission alert. Communications Officer Nereidaz moved quickly to her portable console, her fingers dancing over controls as she processed the signal. "Commander," she said, her voice reflecting growing confusion, "we're receiving a transmission from an unknown source. The signal is coming from our own detention section, but our equipment shows no active transmitters in that area." On screen, Vexay ordered, though they all suspected what they would find. The holographic display shimmered and resolved into an image of Marcus sitting calmly in his detention cell. But something was different about him now. The careful mask of normalcy that he had maintained during his captivity had been replaced by something more authentic. More genuinely human, his eyes held depths that seemed to reflect an understanding far beyond what any individual consciousness should possess. "Commander Vexhai," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly despite the lack of any detectable transmission equipment, "I believe it's time for us to have a more honest conversation." Veshkai immediately activated his security console, checking the containment field status and conducting an emergency scan of the detention section. "Commander, the containment field is operating normally, and our scans show no sign of any communication equipment." "I don't understand how this transmission is possible." Marcus seemed to hear the security chief's comment despite their communication channel being set to receive only. "The method isn't important, security chief. What matters is that we address the situation that has developed over the past several hours. You've learned things that change the nature of our relationship, and we need to discuss how to proceed." Commander Vexahai stepped closer to the holographic display. "You're monitoring our conversations. You know what we've discussed. I'm aware of your growing understanding of the situation," Marcus replied carefully. "I know that you're struggling with questions about what to report to your superiors, how to handle knowledge that could destabilize galactic civilization. These are the same questions that humanity has wrestled with for millennia." "And what answers did your species reach?" Vexhai asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his expression reflecting the weight of ages. "We learned that some truths are too dangerous to share freely, but too important to hide completely. We learned that protection sometimes requires deception, but deception always carries the risk of betrayal. Most importantly, we learned that the choice between revealing our true nature and maintaining our guardianship was one that each species would eventually have to make for themselves. Zara felt a chill of understanding. You're saying that this moment was inevitable, that eventually someone would discover your secret and force this decision. Every human in the galaxy has spent their entire life preparing for this possibility, Marcus confirmed. We knew that our protection could only remain hidden for so long before someone with sufficient telepathic ability would penetrate our barriers. We've been ready for this moment for longer than your civilization has existed. The implications were staggering. The entire conversation, the interrogation, even Zara's successful breach of Marcus's mental barriers had been anticipated by the human collective. They had allowed this discovery to occur, which meant they had already decided how to respond to it. What happens now? Nereidez asked, her empathic senses detecting currents of vast purpose and carefully controlled power that emanated from Marcus's image. Now you make a choice, Marcus replied. The same choice that humanity made when we first inherited our abilities, the same choice that every species must make when they become aware of capabilities that could reshape their universe. He leaned forward slightly, and the officers around the table could feel the weight of his attention like a physical presence. You can report what you've learned to your superiors, triggering a chain of events that will force humanity to abandon secrecy in favor of more direct forms of protection. You can attempt to use this knowledge for political or military advantage, discovering whether our patience has limits. Or you can become part of the network of awareness that helps maintain the stability we've all worked so hard to preserve. You're asking us to join a conspiracy, Veshkai said bluntly. I'm asking you to become guardians, Marcus corrected, to take responsibility for protecting something larger than yourselves, even when that protection requires personal sacrifice. Commander Vexhay studied the human's image, his telepathic senses confirming the sincerity behind the offer. And if we refuse? If we decide that our duty to the Etherian people requires us to report what we've learned? Marcus's expression remained calm, but something in his eyes suggested depths of resolve that made even the battle-hardened security chief uncomfortable. Then we'll respect your decision and adapt our protection accordingly. But I should warn you that forcing humanity to abandon subtlety in favor of visibility would change the galaxy in ways that none of us can fully predict. You're threatening us, Veshkai accused. I'm informing you, Marcus replied with quiet dignity. Humanity has spent millennia developing techniques for protecting species that don't know they need protection. We've built our entire civilization around the principle of invisible guardianship. If that approach is no longer viable, we'll have to develop new methods. Whether those methods will be as benevolent as our current approach remains to be seen. The holographic transmission flickered slightly, and Marcus's voice carried a note of strain that suggested maintaining the communication was requiring enormous effort. I don't have much longer to maintain this contact without risking the containment systems that keep this ship and everyone on it safe. You need to make your decision soon. Zara found herself thinking about the network of human consciousness she had briefly touched, the vast web of protective intent that spanned the galaxy. She remembered the sense of profound love and responsibility she had felt from the collective, the willingness to sacrifice individual recognition for the greater good of all sentient life. What would joining your network require? She asked. Nothing you wouldn't freely give, Marcus replied. Awareness of the truth you've already learned. Commitment to protecting that truth when necessary. Willingness to help guide your species away from actions that might threaten galactic stability. He paused, then added with something that might have been hope in his voice, and the knowledge that you're part of something larger than any single species, something dedicated to preserving and protecting all conscious life in the galaxy. The senior staff exchanged glances, each of them processing the magnitude of the choice they faced. Join a secret network of galactic guardians, or trigger a crisis that could fundamentally alter the nature of interspecies relations throughout known space. Commander Vexai looked at each of his officers in turn, reading their expressions and sensing their emotional states through his limited telepathic abilities. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command and the burden of responsibility. "We need time to consider this decision," he said. "Time to understand the full implications of either choice." Marcus nodded, though the strain of maintaining the transmission was becoming more apparent. "You have until we reach the next star system. After that, maintaining this level of communication without revealing my true capabilities to your entire crew will become impossible." The holographic image began to fade, but before it disappeared completely, Marcus spoke one final time. "Remember, Commander, that the choice you make won't just affect your crew or your species. It will determine whether the protection that has preserved galactic peace for millennia can continue, or whether humanity must find new ways to guard those who may no longer welcome our guardianship." As the transmission ended, leaving the senior staff alone with their thoughts and their impossible decision, none of them noticed the subtle changes that were occurring throughout the ship. Systems were optimizing themselves, efficiency ratings were improving, and probability calculations were being processed by computers that should have lacked the capacity for such complex operations. Even as they debated the future of galactic civilization, Marcus was continuing to protect them, ensuring that their ship remained as safe and capable as possible, regardless of the choice they ultimately made. It was a demonstration of the very principle he had been trying to explain. True protection required no recognition, no gratitude, no acknowledgement of the sacrifice involved. In less than 18 hours, the Thought Seeker would arrive at the Kepler station, where they were scheduled to transfer their prisoner to higher authorities for further interrogation. By then, they would have to decide whether Marcus would arrive as a secret guardian whose true nature remained hidden, or as the first human in galactic history to be revealed as something far more than he appeared to be. The choice they made would echo across the stars, determining the future of every species in the galaxy, and the nature of the protection they had unknowingly relied upon for so long. The final hours before their arrival at Kepler Station passed with agonizing slowness aboard the Thought Seeker. Commander Vexai had dismissed his senior staff to consider their options privately, but the weight of their collective decision hung over the ship like a gravitational field that affected every system and every crew member. Even those who hadn't been briefed on the situation could sense that something momentous was approaching, though they couldn't identify the source of their unease. Zara stood in her quarters, gazing out at the stars that no longer seemed like distant points of light, but rather nodes in a vast network of protection and purpose that she was only beginning to understand. The knowledge she carried felt like a physical burden, pressing against her consciousness with implications that grew more complex each time she examined them. She had devoted her life to uncovering truth, but now she faced a truth so vast that revealing it might destroy the very thing it was meant to protect. Her communication console chimed softly, indicating an incoming message from Commander Vexai. The text was brief: "Senior staff meeting in Conference Room Alpha. Final decision required." As she made her way through the corridors, Sarah noticed that the ship's efficiency improvements had continued to expand. Systems that had shown minor wear patterns were now operating at peak capacity. The artificial gravity felt more stable than she had ever experienced on any vessel. Even the lighting seemed optimized to reduce eye strain and promote mental clarity among the crew. Marcus was still protecting them, still ensuring their safety even as they debated whether to expose the greatest secret in galactic history. The conference room was already occupied when she arrived. Commander Vexai sat at the head of the oval table, his expression reflecting the weight of command in its most demanding form. The other senior officers were arranged around the table, each lost in contemplation of a choice that would define their careers and possibly their entire civilization's future. "Officers," Vexai began once they were all assembled, "we are 6 hours from Kepler Station. In 6 hours, we must transfer our prisoner to Intelligence Command for further interrogation, or we must find an alternative course of action. The decision we make will be irreversible, and its consequences will extend far beyond this ship or even our species. Science Officer Cathara activated her holographic display, showing system diagnostic reports that painted a picture of unprecedented improvement throughout the ship. Commander, the modifications that Marcus has implemented are beyond anything our technology should be capable of achieving. If we report these improvements along with the circumstances that led to them, Intelligence Command will have concrete proof that human capabilities far exceed our assessments, which means they'll recommend preemptive action to the Allied Species Council, Security Chief Veshkai added grimly. Once the military leadership sees evidence of this level of technological manipulation, they'll interpret it as an existential threat requiring immediate response. Navigation Officer Yelon gestured to star charts showing human settlements throughout the local galactic sector. The strategic implications are staggering. If every human vessel, every human colony, every human outpost possesses capabilities we can't detect or counter, then our entire defensive planning is based on false assumptions. But that's exactly the point, Communications Officer Neredes interjected, her empathic abilities detecting the emotional undercurrents of their discussion. Our defensive planning has been unnecessary because we've been under protection this entire time. The threats we've been preparing for have been neutralized before we even knew they existed. Zara found herself remembering the vast network of human consciousness she had briefly touched, the millions of guardians scattered throughout the galaxy who devoted their lives to preventing conflicts that other species never knew were approaching. The question we're really facing, she said quietly, is whether we're willing to trust in protection we can't see or control, or whether we need the illusion of independence even if it makes us less safe. Commander Vexhai leaned back in his chair, his telepathic senses reading the emotional resonance of each officer's position. I've been in contact with Marcus over the past few hours. Nothing formal, just awareness. I can sense his presence throughout the ship, maintaining systems, monitoring for threats, ensuring our safety even while we debate his fate. He paused, then continued with something that might have been wonder in his voice. Do you know what I find most remarkable about this situation? Marcus could end this discussion at any time. He could disable our communication systems, alter our navigation computers, even modify our memories to ensure that his secret remains safe. He has the power to solve this problem through force or deception, but he's chosen instead to leave the decision to us. Because that's what Guardians do, Zara realized aloud. They protect people's right to make their own choices, even when those choices might be wrong. The weight of that understanding settled over the conference room. They weren't just deciding whether to expose humanity's secret, they were being trusted with the kind of choice that defined the character of a civilization. Would they choose safety through dependence or independence through risk? Would they trust in protection they couldn't control or demand transparency that might destroy the very thing that kept them safe? I've made my decision, Commander Vexhai announced. But before I share it, I want to hear from each of you. This choice is too important for any single person to make alone. Science Officer Cathara spoke first, her crystalline appendages flickering with patterns that indicated deep conviction. The scientific part of me wants to study these capabilities, to understand how they work and what they mean for our knowledge of physics and consciousness. But the rational part of me recognizes that some knowledge comes with responsibilities we're not ready to handle. I vote to maintain the secret. Security Chief Veshkai was quiet for a long moment before responding. My training tells me that unknown capabilities represent unacceptable risks. But my experience tells me that the only thing more dangerous than an unknown enemy is betraying an unknown ally. If humanity has been protecting us for millennia, then exposing them would be the act of cowards and fools. I vote to join their network. Navigation Officer Leylon nodded slowly. The star charts show human settlements in every region of strategic importance, positioned to respond to threats that we've never had to face because they prevented them. That level of foresight and commitment deserves respect, not betrayal. I vote to maintain the secret. Communications Officer Neredes spoke with the certainty that her empathic abilities provided. I can sense the emotional resonance that emanates from Marcus even when he's maintaining his barriers. There's no deception there, no hidden agenda, only a profound commitment to protecting life and consciousness throughout the galaxy. I vote to become part of that protection." All eyes turned to Zara, whose telepathic probe had started this entire crisis. She thought about the moment when Marcus had allowed her to glimpse the truth behind humanity's carefully maintained facade, the vast sacrifice involved in choosing protection over recognition. "I became a mind weaver to uncover truth," she said finally. "But I've learned that some truths are meant to be shared responsibly, not revealed carelessly. The truth about humanity's nature is one that each species must discover when they're ready to handle the responsibility that comes with it. I vote to guard that truth until our civilization has evolved enough to be worthy of it." Commander Vex High nodded, his expression reflecting a mixture of relief and determination. "Then we're unanimous. The official report will state that Marcus Chen is a human trader who was carrying agricultural equipment that could have dual-use applications. He'll be released at Kepler Station with a warning about proper cargo documentation. The energy anomalies detected during his detention will be attributed to quantum field fluctuations caused by our ship's aging systems. He activated his command console and began entering the authorization codes that would finalize their decision. But unofficially, we'll be accepting Marcus's invitation to join the network of awareness that helps maintain galactic stability. We'll become guardians ourselves, helping to protect a secret that protects us all. As if responding to their decision, the ship's communication system activated with a familiar presence. Marcus appeared on the holographic display, but this time his image seemed more substantial, more present than before. "Thank you," he said simply, and the gratitude in his voice carried depths that touched each officer's consciousness. "You've chosen to trust in something you can't fully understand or control. That takes wisdom and courage that many species never develop." "What happens now?" Zara asked. "Now you learn," Marcus replied. "Gradually, carefully, at a pace that won't overwhelm your understanding or compromise your psychological stability. You'll be given access to information networks that span the galaxy, awareness of threat patterns that your species has never had to face, insight into the careful balance that maintains peace among hundreds of civilizations." His expression grew more serious. "But most importantly, you'll learn what it means to carry responsibility for beings who may never know they're being protected. You'll understand the burden of choosing protection over recognition, service over power, guardianship over domination." Commander Vex Hei leaned forward, "And if other Etherian vessels discover human capabilities through their own investigations, then they'll face the same choice you've faced," Marcus said. "Each species, each individual, each consciousness must decide for themselves what kind of universe they want to live in. We can guide that choice, but we can't make it for them." Over the next several hours, as the Thought Seeker approached Kepler Station, the senior staff experienced their first lessons in guardianship. Through carefully controlled telepathic connections, Marcus began sharing information about threat assessment protocols, about the subtle ways that civilizations could be guided away from destructive paths, about the network of coordination that allowed millions of human guardians to work together across impossible distances. Zara found herself marveling at the complexity of what she had become part of. It wasn't just a conspiracy or a secret organization. It was something approaching a new form of consciousness itself, one that existed to protect and preserve other forms of consciousness without demanding recognition or reward. When they finally docked at Kepler Station, Marcus Chen was processed as a human traitor who had been cleared of all charges. The Teptu, he departed the ship with the same unremarkable demeanor he had maintained throughout his detention, carrying his simple cargo hauler's gear and attracting no attention from station security. But as he walked down the corridor toward the civilian passenger sections, Zara caught one final glimpse of him through her enhanced awareness. For just a moment, she perceived him as he truly was, not a simple trader, but a guardian whose responsibilities spanned star systems, whose consciousness was connected to a network of protection that embraced the entire galaxy. Then the moment passed, and Marcus disappeared into the crowd of beings moving through Kepler Station, just another human pursuing the everyday business of interstellar commerce. But Zara knew that she would never see him or any other human in quite the same way again. The Thoughtseeker departed Kepler Station with its crew forever changed. They carried new knowledge, new responsibilities, and new awareness of their place in a universe far more complex and carefully protected than they had ever imagined. They had learned that sometimes the greatest truth was knowing when truth should be protected rather than revealed. And throughout the galaxy, in 1,000 different star systems, human guardians continued their eternal vigilance, watching over civilizations that would never know how much they owed to the species that had chosen protection over power, service over recognition, love over fear. The secret remained safe, guarded now not just by humanity, but by others who had proven themselves worthy of sharing the burden. And in the vast network of consciousness that connected all the galaxy's protectors, new nodes of awareness had been added. New guardians had been welcomed into a responsibility that would define the rest of their lives. The stars themselves seemed brighter somehow, as if the light they shed carried not just photons but purpose, not just energy but the eternal promise that consciousness would be protected, that life would be cherished, and that love would triumph over all the dark forces that threatened the precious gift of awareness in an infinite universe. In the end, Zara realized, the greatest discovery wasn't what humans were, but what they chose to be. And now, having been trusted with that secret, she and her fellow guardians face the same choice every day: to use their knowledge and abilities for protection rather than power, for service rather than domination, for love rather than fear. It was a choice that would echo through time itself. With Trust Teddy, she read the human's mind and learned he had always protected her. HFY Stories. Best HFY Stories.